All right, folks, it is September of 2024, and Jason is still on vacation. And we are joined today by friend of the show, longtime CS2 presenter, smartest man in CMMC, the great and powerful Ryan Bonner, Lego aficionado, air horns in the background. Everyone should be familiar with Ryan. Ryan, how are you?
Doing pretty good. I haven't built any Legos today, but I'll work on that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's unacceptable. That is unacceptable. So, for those of you who are not familiar, one of the most popular videos ever posted on the Summit 7 YouTube channel, and one of the most commonly referenced in the wild. I've seen this on Reddit. I've seen this on Discord. I've seen this on LinkedIn. One of the most organically popular CS2 sessions of all time was the session that you gave at CS2 Denver last year, how to know if you have CUI. This is the number one thing that people Google. Doesn't matter how much work I put into various blog posts, they still get absolutely stomped by people searching for that information. This is the question that everybody has. It is the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega of everything else that comes through for DFARS cyber clauses, CMMC, NIST controls. It all centers around this one problem. And holy crap, is it a big problem. So just to frame the problem for everyone, it really, in essence, it comes down to this. DFARS clause 252-204-7012 by default goes into all DoD contracts and solicitations. It tells you to apply and implement the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 if you're handling CUI. But it doesn't do anything else besides that. It is now up to you, the contractor, up to you, the person who's bidding on this work, to try and figure out if you're going to have this data. There's no clause that tells you that there's data. There is no FAR CUI clause that informs you of what data categories you're going to be handling. And if you don't get that clause taken out of your contract, that is a way to end up with CMMC, NIST SP 800-171, big expenditures and projects and work in the future. So it comes down to, you are going to get the clause by default. You may not necessarily have the data by default. And now it's your problem instead of the government's problem to get the clause out of your contract. So it all centers around your ability to understand CUI, probably better than your government customers, navigate the definitions of CUI, probably better than your customers, negotiate requirements around CUI, probably better than your customers. And there is no person that I know of, this is true, that knows this topic and space better than Ryan Bonner. So please, Ryan, you are here to update your talk from Denver with a deep dive into distribution statements. Take it away. What do we need to know?
Sure. Well, and this comes off of having given that CUI talk, and then later having some really significant things happen. In particular, we started to see updates to the DoD's CUI registry that add additional layers of clarification to some things that we didn't have back when we gave that talk. Some of the things that I found really interesting were the DoD adding legal authorities to CUI categories that aren't in the CUI registry, which hasn't been updated. And that changes dynamics. I mean,
we just did this episode where, we found out that in these 2-ish years of the NARA CUI registry sort of being in a holding pattern, there's potentially new executive orders and changes to how the process works and blah, blah, blah. And in the interim, the DoD has stood up their own CUI registry. And you're saying that there are some differences here that are informative to this discussion.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest difference that I keep running into that's important is the DoD's decision to include the U.S. munitions list and the commerce control list as authorities for controlled technical information?
Well, that's very interesting, because for those of you that haven't been paying attention to the news, there was a recent settlement with RTX/Raytheon for $200 million for 750 violations of ITAR. And in the charging letter, which we'll link below, it's a good read. They sit there and they say you had a unauthorized export, an unauthorized retransfer, an unauthorized this, blah, 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 of United States munition list USML category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's like 15 categories. It's like pages and pages and pages of this technical data. There's even, people may find interesting, paragraphs within the USML categories that talk about the technical information related to those categories. So it doesn't even, it's not like you have to hand somebody like the thing, the jet engine, even the technical information, blueprints, and so on and so forth can count. So it makes sense that they would say that those are authorities, because it's good enough for DDTC to slap somebody around for $50 million if you're Boeing in February and $200 million if you're Raytheon in August.
Yeah, and I think that when you start to see those connections being made, right, between the ITAR and EAR, when we talk about controlled technical information, you got to remember that the DoD outkicked their coverage when they defined CTI in DFARS 7012, right? They kind of just came up with a name for something and then said, well, we mentioned it for the first time in this clause, therefore, ta-da, here's a new category of CUI. And to make things even more confusing, when they try to describe it to you, they use like kind of like adjacent language to existing legal authorities, but instead of just pointing to that authority. So I really think that the DoD closed that gap when they updated their CUI registry. They said, hey, just to be clear, when you go over to the export controlled information category, you see a bunch of stuff that's not the U.S. munitions list, that's not the commerce control list. Other stuff fits into that category, like just your applications to the State Department for like registration for certain things. Okay, let's narrow this down. When I talk about controlled technical information, I am just talking about ITAR technical data and EAR controlled technology that is then also, meeting these other conditions for being produced on a government contract, being possessed or created by the government. Like, this is a much narrower aperture than the export controlled information category, even though they share authorities.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a clarification. The other big thing that jumped out to me in updates to the DoD CUI program's website, which contains that registry, is frequently asked questions. And there's
always an adventure whenever they update frequently asked questions.
Absolutely. And there's an absolute banger in there, which is the use of distribution statements.
Yes.
And so
just let me sort of frame this for those of you at home. If you were to only read the definition of this information that would be CUI in DFARS 7012, you would be led to believe that anything with a DoD distribution statement on it is automatically going to be considered CUI. And that's basically all the information that we have at this point. This is why we're diving into this specifically, because that's what DFARS 7012 would lead you to believe.
Yeah, and the reason that crime is committed, if you will, is that just as an by the way, while defining controlled technical information, the DoD just casually mentions that like CTI will have a DoD distribution statement B through F on it. So if you follow the wrong cycle, if you backfeed that into anything with a distribution statement, you're like, is everything with a distribution statement CUI?
They need to make a series of Venn diagrams. It needs to be a regulation that you can only update these types of data definitions if there's Venn diagrams. Like all distribution statements are CTI, or all CTI will have distribution statements, not vice versa, right?
Yeah, exactly. They don't fully overlap. And so, if you're trying to understand that, just, if you think that anything with a distribution statement is CUI, the DoD would disagree with you. So from that FAQ, they say that, the application of a distribution statement does not, these are their words, does not automatically mean the document is CUI. And not every document containing CUI requires a distribution statement. So you've got drift in that
Great.
overlap.
That second
Right?
one really, yeah, we were doing great on the first one, and then they had to throw that second one in.
Yeah. So when you're trying to understand how they could say that, dig into DoD Instruction 523024. That's the DoD's own document on how to handle distribution statements.
Recently updated.
Yeah, yeah, and really, they will tell you that for statements B through F, those can apply to classified information, to CUI, and unclassified technical information. So they also then continue that statement by saying in their little paragraph on CTI and unclassified technical information that legacy material marked already with distribution statements, right? It's only going to be marked as CUI if, and I'm going to quote here, if a careful analysis determines that it qualifies as CUI.
Well, if we know anything about the people slapping distribution statements on stuff, it's that their middle name is careful analysis before they do that. So let me ask you this from the perspective of contractors who are dipping their toes into this water. Is it still a good rule of thumb that if you're seeing distribution statements come from your customers, that there's a chance that it's likely going to be covered data? Is that still a general rule of thumb?
Well, it's definitely something that should get your radar activated, right? And it's certainly something that you will want to look for other information on that document or supplemental information around.
We'll put it
that
this
document.
way. If you're seeing distribution statements, you have to at least get this question answered, because if you ignore it, it's going to be enough that it's going to get you looped into implementing requirements, getting certifications and stuff like that. Like if you see it, you have to deal with it, right? It's like water coming out from underneath your dishwasher. Like we need to address this.
Yeah. You can't just say it's okay because dishwashers have water, therefore this is fine, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that once you sort of start to like put a crowbar in the sort of logical fallacy that it's always CUI, you didn't fully solve the equation. Okay, then under what circumstances would it be CUI, right? If it's not good enough to just see the distribution statement and make a quick judgment, you gotta drill down, right? So if those legacy markings aren't enough, I feel like there's probably a good, better, best approach here, right? I mean, the best case scenario is the document, in addition to a distribution statement, already has a CUI designation indicator on the first page, right? I mean, that'd be great.
Yeah. Easy day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But in lieu of that, I think maybe the next best thing would be that in the distribution statement, the reason why it got the statement, they call that the defense category, would be CTI, controlled technical information. And the only reason that works really well is because that's the only defense category in a distribution statement that always results in CUI, like just 1-to-1.
So if it's not marked as CUI, but in the distribution statement, you see defense category in there annotated properly, it tells you that it is CUI. It's just maybe doesn't have the right header and footer and things like that.
Yeah, and that controlled technical information, or CTI shortcode, in the written out defense or distribution statement, that's the only one that is a 1-to-1 with a CUI category, and that's where the difficulty comes in, right? The others are not that accurate.
Well, Ryan, I hate to break it to you, but I have this one simple trick that CUI minimization consulting firms absolutely hate. Why don't I just crop the drawing so that the distribution statement isn't on it anymore?
Well, yeah, that would be a bad idea for a lot of reasons. The process by which those distribution statements are added to a document is not our process, right? That's the DoD's process. And if they put that marking on that document, I would not feel good unenrolling that document from their process.
Yeah.
Instead, I want to push to get an understanding on CUI category.
Right.
That's where I have the most agency, no pun intended, to make a difference in whether I can say this is or is not
right.
CUI.
Mopping up the water doesn't stop the leak here.
Yeah, and with decades of legacy distribution mark documents, we're not going to have the CTI marking. It's new,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So,
Well, here's a question for you, and I don't know if you know who does apply the distribution statements. Does that happen at a component level? Is that happening at the program office level, like the PEO level? Like, does anybody actually know when that happens? Like, or like where in the process does it happen? I've never actually been able to find that out inside the department.
yeah, when you read that instruction that I just mentioned, it
Yeah.
does lay out responsibilities at the component level, for example. But the actual work instruction of like how to apply the correct marking, you're not going to find that in a document that's
Right.
this widely distributed.
I've talked to a lot of program managers and contract officers, and I'm like, is there like one office where they have all like that's where it gets applied? It's just I would love if anyone listening has actually been the person to put the distribution statement on the document. I would love to talk to you. So please let us know in the comments below because you're a unicorn. No one's ever seen or heard of you. Someone's putting these markings on these documents, and they've been putting distribution statements on documents since like 1984. So someone's doing this work. I would love to actually talk to them about what that's like because we can read the instruction, but there are humans doing this. So
Yeah, and whoever you talk to on that, when they do tell you that story, I can't help but think that a lot of these decisions are probably made at a program level, and then there's a lot of marking trickle down. We'll just
yeah,
put it
well,
that
this is
way.
where you're supposed to take your mask off and be like, it was me all along.
we decide markings once a year, and then everyone just
We have an offsite, and then we just spin a big wheel.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, again, if we're not getting CUI designation indicators, and we're not lucky enough to get a distribution statement that just says straight up this is CTI, like the next best thing we could do is to try and research the possible CUI authorities that line up with some of these other defense categories we'd see in a distribution statement, right? So that I think is where we find ourselves as industry. But I think there's some really powerful things we can learn just by doing that. So if you're not familiar, the instruction that we keep talking about, DoD Instruction 523024, this isn't its first revision. And as Jacob, you've sometimes bemoaned, like things sometimes lose detail. Sometimes stuff gets stripped out that used to be more explicit, and that's not helpful. So older versions of that instruction used to be more verbose in helping you understand the laws or regulations that could be a reason to assign one of these defense categories. And so if we wind back the clock, scoop up some of those authorities, and then sort of shuttle those forward into the newer version of these marking instructions, I think we get a more complete view. And so when we get down into some of these defense categories, we can actually start to say, I think here's my short list of laws and regulations that would have necessitated adding this defense category in a statement. And so then what does that tell us? Is that a CUI authority or not? And so interesting things start to happen. So obviously we already talked about CTI, right? Its authorities are, Title 10, Section 130.
Yeah, you can go find them.
Not being able to withhold
the
things.
The idea here being is if we drill into these distribution statements, we should be able to find the authority that makes it CUI or not. And if it's not CUI, then we can push back on the customer and say, no, 7012 does not apply. Get it out of here. Therefore, CMMC does not apply. Get it out of here. Or you can minimize your scope for what it does apply to because you have a better understanding of like this actually is CUI or not. That's why we're trying to do this reverse engineering process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're going to find in most cases is that in the fog of war with this defense category that was added, knowing that sometimes it wasn't added for reasons that make something CUI, like it's eligible to be CUI, but yeah. Just knowing the CUI category suddenly snaps into focus. Okay, well, if I can understand that category's authorities, I can probably find out if what I'm looking at qualifies as CUI. And
Well, let
so,
me let the remote module that DoD controls in my brain take over here real quick. But Ryan, just treat everything as CUI. What's the big deal? Like, why not? Why go through this process? Just treat it all as CUI. The DoD loves saying this, right? They say it in their rules, they say it in their webinars. They're like, but why wouldn't you just treat everything like CUI?
yeah. And I think the reason for that is when an agency has something that's CUI and they choose to, I don't know, send it to someone else, they don't have to issue a subcontract and then manage that third party and their ability to safeguard the information. They can just blow it out the airlock and say, there you go.
Right. Yeah. And I think the line that I love the most in your presentation CS2 is like, you can't treat everything as CUI because we don't have unlimited resources. Like, we don't just have the ability to do that. Like, it's just not how it works. It's just not how it works.
Yeah. And there's organizational friction and complexity every time you move the data to a new place. So that's one of those things that, you can't have mixed messaging on that. You can't say just treat it all as CUI. If that was true, why even try to define it?
Right. Yeah.
Why even have a CUI registry?
Right.
Just say everything, but you aren't supported enough by laws and regulations to do that.
Right.
Otherwise, you just came up with a new law.
Right. And this is maybe just to put a pin on this, and we'll get back into it, is that reverse engineering the specific authorities that are going to trigger obligations for you is important, because the government doesn't get to say everything is covered data. These are the rules that they have to play by. And so if you know the rules of the game, it lets you take advantage of the rules of the game to either no longer have to play or minimize the cost of playing their game. That's why digging into these authorities is so important, because they have to trace it to a actual authority.
Yeah, and it's also really important because if you skip to the end where you've maybe figured out some of those things, if you know the law or regulation that acts as an authority for a category, and you are reading that authority and you arrive at the limits of what it tries to control, and you find your information outside of those limits, you just found data that isn't subject to that authority. And now you can probably build an argument that it's not CUI.
Yep.
That's got to be a superpower in preserving your supply chain, in reducing and limiting scope, and reducing cost and complexity.
Are you listening, mega primes? Are you listening, people who may have settled for $50 to $200 million in the last several months about issues around this data? There are literally, oh my God, there are literally examples in the charging letters from DDTC of employees at the primes going, we thought it was EAR 99 information that we can just send anywhere without an export license. Whoopsie daisy, it's actually an electronics module that goes inside the F-22. That's a true story. That's a true story. It is very important to understand where the lines are on the information categories. Please, for the love of God.
Yeah, and without exercising any magical thinking or letting an assumption carry forward until it has real consequences. So,
yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's enough tangents there. Please get on back to the magic show.
Yeah. So let's just maybe we don't have time to go through every possible defense category, right? That could find its way into a distribution statement. But let's maybe just think about some, or maybe even just get into like a very real example, right? So I'm looking at a distribution statement, and that statement has a defense category. Let's say it's distribution statement D, and the defense category is contractor performance evaluation, right? I can probably then go into the historical lists of the reference authorities for that, and I would find an authority. It's 48 CFR 3.1044, which is called Disclosure, Protection, and Marking of Contractor Bid or proposal information and source selection information.
Mm-hmm.
So like we're like, talk about a specific rule.
Yep.
Like this kind of information.
This is a specific authority. It is a regulation that went through rulemaking talking about this specific information.
Yeah. And you drill down, you actually read that authority, and it defines bidder proposal information and it defines source selection information. So like I can be looking at that document marked that way and say, okay, is this bid prices that I submitted to an agency or that someone else submitted to an agency in response to an invitation for bids? Yes, no. Is this a list of bid prices received before opening the bid? So like sealed bid responses? Yes, no. Is this proposed costs or prices? You can see the trend here. Is this information, I'm kidding, I'm not even kidding here. Is this information marked with the phrase source selection information, CFAR 2.101 and 3.104? Like, yes or no.
Right. These are answerable, knowable, finite questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other kinds of source selection information, but like if you ended up with one of these, something went horribly wrong. Like a technical evaluation.
This is an example, but this process works for everything. There has to be an authority somewhere. There are CUI categories because there are authorities, not the other way around, right? Which means you can go back through the system and get to the specific authority that says this type of thing means this, which lets you ask the question, is this data that I'm looking at in that definition or not?
Yeah. So if I'm looking at that piece of paper, that document, and I don't see those things defined with that defense category, if it's not classified and it's not CUI, there's that third option, which is just unclassified information. And that's so important, right? I mean, I think that a lot of organizations don't even understand that unclassified information that is not controlled is an option, right? So
we've talked about this before in our many lengthy conversations on this topic. There used to be an idea of uncontrolled unclassified information as the opposite of controlled unclassified information, but it didn't stick around. So we had CUI and we had UUI, in the sense that there are two buckets of unclassified information, that kind that is controlled and that kind that is uncontrolled, which honestly might be helpful if they had kept it around, because by only having CUI as the definition, you end up with this sort of lazy logic of like, well, everything that's unclassified is controlled now.
Yeah, I know it's not this, so it must be this other thing. If you take one of the options off the board, then yeah, people are going to overgeneralize. So like if you're not familiar with this idea of UUI, uncontrolled unclassified information, like NARA has a definition for it, right? Yeah. They say that it's information that's neither CUI or classified, get it, but it's still subject to agency public release policies.
Sure.
So I think I just described FCI. I think I did. So, and that is the split where people realize it's not that because it's not CUI, it's now public, right? We're not saying that. And it's not that because it's not CUI that there's no burden to safeguard it. That's literally why FCI exists. So showing people that you might actually just be stepping down from CUI to FCI, hopefully doesn't cause people to think that they just went into free fall.
Yeah.
From a protection perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of actually running through this process, I mean, this is not a theoretical process. I mean, your consulting firm specializes in walking people through this process. Like we have worked together with companies who have gone through this process. I mean, and you have seen this work successfully. I mean, this is literally what you do for a living is navigate people down this river, right?
Yeah, and there's more multidisciplinary aspects of this than I ever thought getting into this space. And there's way more soft skills, I think, than you might realize when you're trying to integrate this into like an overall approach. You go talk to somebody who doesn't have to interface with the person who signs checks at the customer side, and they want to start fighting people on CUI definitions. They want to start burning it all down. And that will not work. You only have so much capital to spend socially
Yeah.
with these customers. And so you have to operate out of a catalog of potential responses and ways to manage poor identification from your customer, or overly broad blanket statements about a whole contractor program, or all of these other things. And you have to shape the information space in the gap that exists between you and your customer, and know that when you respond, like how that's going to create friction or not, and
Yeah.
then how you're going to handle that internally. And there's just, there's a lot of if then things that you need to solve for when you're
Yeah.
going through this.
Yeah, it's definitely a process, but yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen in real life. I've seen it save people money. I've seen it get people out of obligations altogether in certain situations when they would have otherwise thought this is absolutely something that's going to apply to us. Now, long-term strategic benefit of avoiding the requirements when the entire ecosystem is moving in the direction of sort of requiring them by default, that's a strategic decision that you have to make. But you can fight back here. Like, you are capable of figuring, you can read the information for yourself. There's probably some sort of jumbled metaphor here of you taking the CUI registry and like knifing it to the church door here, being like, we can all read this information for ourselves. Like, it doesn't have to be interpreted for us. It's an extremely powerful exercise to go through, and it's something that everybody should, because scoping, I mean, look at the allegations facing Georgia Tech. Georgia, one of the main things that the charges open up with is that they improperly scoped their environment, which is a function of your data flows, which is a function of your understanding of these data types, which requires you to be familiar with the underlying authorities and the DoD instruction that sort of links the two together.
Yeah. And, in the case of Georgia Tech, you see a lot of the same arguments in that complaint that people are battling through inside their own organization. It wasn't completely clear which data was the data that required those safeguards. There might have been smoke, but we didn't see fire, or whatever those things are. But you got to ask at the end of the day, let's say you beat the charge, was it worth it to have to go through that process? Did you permanently benefit from that? There's no benefit to going through that.
Yeah. And at least if you go through this effort, right, you have a defensible reasoning for why we scoped the way we did or not, because we went through this analysis, instead of just being like, well, we just sort of felt like that was the right way to deviate, unless you want to be in this situation, which a lot of people don't like, where if you don't go through this sort of careful analysis, then you end up having to err on the safe side and scope everything in, and your entire environment is going to be in there, which puts you right back into the same problem. If we're going to fight against the government saying treat everything as CUI because we don't have enough resources, but then we don't go through the analysis on our end and we just scope everything in, you're effectively treating everything as CUI, and you've got nothing out of that argument.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we always talk about as a team. We use a quote, easy decision, hard life, hard decision, easy life. Like, if you front load the difficulty on CUI determination, you are absolutely going to reap benefits downstream or to the right on the timeline. But when you make that like overly simplistic decision, we'll just treat everything as if it's CUI. Are you looking at the new expanded scope of CMMC?
Yeah.
Because we have plenty of organizations who started out saying we'll just treat everything as CUI, and who now are being like dragged through the grist mill of like, well, don't forget your entire enterprise IT organization is now in scope. Oh, and hey, don't forget all your security tools are now in scope. And hey, don't forget all of your external service providers are in scope. It's this doubling, tripling, quadrupling
It's
of
the
the scope.
worst. It's the worst spa day imaginable. Get it? Get it, everybody.
Oh,
If you don't get the pun, go read the scoping guide for security protection assets. I couldn't resist. I apologize. I apologize, everyone.
we'll edit it out. But I mean, those are the kinds of things that easy decision early might
Yeah.
not have felt that impactful, but now, like, the bill comes due, and
Yeah.
you have to do something now with that.
Man. And we've talked about this, right? We've talked about this in some of the books that we have exchanged and recommended to each other, and we see this happen all the time. There is nothing more expensive than rework. If you end up going through a project and setting everything up, and then you have to rework it later because of scope or this or that, it is so time consuming and expensive. It's so much more difficult to do it a second time later than it is to spend the time up front and then make sure that you are doing what you need to do. Like, the rework is just, it's got to be the number one thing that sends people off the rails.
Oh, absolutely. Just the psychological cost of having to walk back to something that you thought was finished is rough.
CMMC is already going to wound you psychologically in many other ways. You don't have to self-inflict any more psychological damage. But speaking of psychological damage, everyone, I have a question that's not on the show script that Ryan doesn't know that I'm about to ask him. So, talking about here at the end, circular authorities that create their own categories and then just sort of like perpetuate themselves. 48 CFR comes up with a definition of information that gets its own CUI category that references back to 48 CFR, and around we go. In the 32 CFR proposed rule, it talks about security protection data. And if the final rule goes through and gets codified as it exists right now, that's a regulation that specifies a data category, which would then create a CUI category. Like, if the only thing that you need to do is promulgate a regulation that says this type of data needs to be protected, that's theoretically all you need to do to make a new category of CUI. So is SPD, security protection data, a category or not? Is this Schrodinger's CUI category because it's a proposed rule? It's simultaneously a category and not, because the rule's not done yet.
Yeah, I think there's two really interesting elements of the DoD choosing to come forward and give a defined name and like really bad meaning or definition to security protection data, like literally just a non-exhaustive list with just two examples.
That's the whole definition. Security stuff.
Yeah. So when you're reading the way that security protection data activates a requirement, right? It's basically saying if you've got a service provider who houses or hosts this kind of data for the defense contractor, it doesn't actually say that data requires safeguarding,
right? Which is the trigger.
Yeah, but it does say that at an org level, that organization needs a certification. So there is a fine line between saying that this is a regulation that requires dissemination control or safeguarding versus just saying the entity needs to have a certification.
Yeah. You have to say Beetlejuice 3 times. You have to say protect or safeguard or prevent from disclosing. You have to say the magic words in order for it to be a category of CUI.
Yeah. The other thing that you have to be aware of is that the core definition of CUI in 32 CFR 2002, it's conditional, right? It says that first, the information needs to be something that is government possessed, government created, or that is produced for the government, by one of these other types of entities like a private company. I don't think anyone is conflating your internal system logs as a non-federal organization operating non-federal systems as a government contract deliverable.
Right.
And so it would be very hard to stretch.
Not even in CISA's wildest dreams could they have concocted such a concept.
Yeah. So let's say, just for intents and purposes, that someone goes ahead and decides to add SPD as a CUI category in the registry. You'd still only be generating that kind of information and having it qualify as CUI if you were doing it for a government agency, probably in one of their federal information systems as a deliverable on a contract.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Well, let me ask you this, since we're, at the end here, with all of your experience analyzing the categories, digging into the instructions, like going through into the machine code underneath how this system works, when you are working with a client and you see a piece of technical information for the first time, are you able to make a snap judgment and say that is CUI or that is not? Or do you still go through this process? Like, it can't be that somebody could see this data and be like, yep, I know the answer, is what I assume you're going to say.
You start to get gut feelings
Mm-hmm.
for sure. But I think the most important thing that you have to do with a document, let's say, like a drawing or whatever it might be, is to recognize the fact that that is a data set.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a single object. So even though the object got a determination, right, it's probably because some things in that data set qualified. So where my brain moves when I'm looking at something that someone puts in front of me that's technical information and saying, is it CUI? I've already started to break it down for parts and say, I see some things here that absolutely feel like CUI for calculated reasons. I also see things in this overall data set that if I needed to extract from this document and key into an ERP, or extract from this data set and put in another document, would not create derivative CUI. And here's why.
Yeah. And I think Brian's being very modest here, everyone. I think that, like we've talked about on the show a lot, is that the way that the system is oriented is that it is easier for your customers, government, large primes, doesn't matter, to make the blanket statement, just treat it all as CUI. Combine that with the fact that 7012 goes into your contracts by default, like we talked about at the beginning, and the pressure is, whether you agree, whether you think it's fair or not, it is the way it is. The pressure is now on you to inform yourself of how to navigate and understand these data categories, the reasons behind them, the authorities that underlie them, and then make a decision about scoping, applicability, or to push back on your customer if that's the right way you want to spend your social capital, as you put it. So it is possible to fight City Hall, or to at least coexist with City Hall, if you will. But it's almost impossible to just make a snap decision and be like, well, it isn't going to be CUI. It does require more work underneath. Any other closing thoughts here, Ryan? I mean, this is obviously a very, very deep topic. Everyone needs to go watch your talk at CS2. I will link to the DoD instructions and the relevant authorities from the examples we talked about in this episode. Everyone should go read them. What else should people know here to close things out?
Just that, you can start out by probably establishing some simpler rules that then you can add to over time and start to, have some of these more nuanced approaches. I can't look at like an organization or their data sets on the outside looking in and say, it's this.
Yeah.
You do have to enter into their context, understand their intellectual property rights, their design authority status, the nature of the contracting work that they do, the clauses they receive. There are many data points that build a more complete mosaic of how big the risk exposure is, how big the CUI definitions could be or might not be, and overall, so many things about the organization are going to play a role there. So everybody here has an advantage when you're working for a contractor. You are the subject matter expert in your context. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference maker in doing these determinations.
Yeah. Well said. Well, just to remind everybody, if you haven't followed Ryan on LinkedIn since you've been listening to this episode, you're wrong. And you need to go do that immediately. Read everything that he puts out, follow him, reach out to him for assistance. He's the guy that I go to for questions, not just on this topic, but grasps of individual controls, questions about the rules and the rulemaking process, he's the guy that I go to for sanity checks and extra information. So, Ryan, thanks for sharing your tremendous amount of knowledge on this topic. We're always getting better whenever we're able to talk to you, man. I appreciate it.
Love to be part of these conversations with you too.
Awesome. All right. See you.